The Vagabond King is a 1930 movie based on an operetta of the same name. The story focuses on a young, poor revolutionary who is arrested by the king and then given the chance to live as a king himself for 7 days before he dies. This, more than most of the other movies I've watched from 1930, feels old and stagey. Everything from the way the musical numbers are staged to the diction habits of our lead actor feels like I'm watching a 1920s stage performance. I did enjoy how one of the musical numbers was suddenly in color. It added a bit of oomph to an otherwise uninteresting song. The staginess isn't necessarily a bad thing for me. It definitely takes a little getting used to, but it gives it an interesting flavor that I hadn't been seeing as much of in my other 1930 films so far. The main character's arc is pretty thin, but the female lead has a much more interesting journey. So if you do watch this, have fun rooting for her. The Song of Lunch is an hour-long television adaptation of a poem of the same name by Christopher Reid. It tells the story of a man, played by Alan Rickman, meeting an old flame for lunch, played by Emma Thompson. The majority of the spoken dialogue is actually voiceover of the man's internal monologue, taken, I suspect, directly from the poem, given the nature of the way the words flow, and it feels like a poem, the way it's written out. It's wholly different from anything else I've seen recently, and that alone made it worth a watch for me, and Rickman crushes it here. Both he and Thompson are experts in the art of showing seething resentment hidden behind a wall of polite British restraint, and that serves them well as the lunch goes rather badly. Sometimes it's difficult to listen to the thoughts in Rickman's character's head. He's a pretty loathsome, self-centered individual, but watching him unravel is a fascinating journey. It definitely makes me want to read the poem itself someday, and I'm glad to have seen this short piece. Nomads centers on a doctor who begins to have unsettling hallucinations and memories that aren't her own after witnessing a man's death in the ER. She realizes she's seeing his memories of a bizarre group of possessed dead bodies and also a cult. While the movie has a couple of really interesting horror bits, the plot is nearly incomprehensible, and we abandon our protagonist abruptly about 15 minutes into the movie to get an extended flashback of a character we never saw. The horror elements get sillier and don't fit together nicely at all, although I do feel like that ending image could be utterly chilling if I was sure I knew what it actually implied, plot-wise. As it is, it gave me a chill and then made me go, but wait, what? For all the good moments this movie has, it has far more terrible ones, and some bad acting from our leading lady and a horrible French accent from Pierce Brosnan doesn't do much to help it along. At least he doesn't sing in this, I guess. She's All That is a romantic teen comedy from the 90s, starring Rachel Lee Cook as the unpopular artistic girl and Freddie Prinze Jr. as the popular jock who makes a bet that he can make any girl homecoming queen, even Cook. The two start hanging out, but of course Prinze starts falling in love with her, and Cook will find out any moment that it was all a bet. The biggest problem with this movie, well, aside from the hilarious girl takes her glasses off and is suddenly hot trope, is that I don't buy the chemistry between the two leads at all. When they start to talk about having actual feelings for each other, it almost startled me, because there was no indication of that up until that point. A rom-com's job is pretty simple. Have its audience live vicariously through its characters as they discover a new romance, and this seems to be missing the most important steps. Cook's journey is more about fighting her own demons by herself than anything to do with him, and his journey is almost non-existent. On top of that, despite describing it as a rom-com, there's not much actual humor in it. Overall, a pretty uninspiring watch. Amistad is Steven Spielberg's dramatization of a real-life trial just prior to the American Civil War, in which a group of Africans stolen from their homes to be slaves rise up against their captors on the sea voyage and are brought to trial once they land in the States. It seems like a pretty straightforward trial, but questions of slavery, political re-election, potential war, and international treaties create a perfect storm of precedent that paved the way for emancipation for the other enslaved Africans in the country. This is a story I honestly knew almost nothing about, so I appreciate learning more about this case. It's also very well told, showcasing all the different political motivations that pushed people in certain directions. It's upsetting, but sadly not surprising, to watch this question of human life and civil rights being argued based around a presidential re-election campaign. I appreciated also that the stories of the captured Africans got some focus, though I wish it had been more prevalent, as it really is their story. Overall, though, a very solid retelling of an important part of U.S. history. Gloria is a Sidney Lumet movie starring Sharon Stone as the titular Gloria, a mobster's girlfriend who just got out of prison. She goes back to her boyfriend, only to find herself in the middle of a complicated situation involving a young boy. The boy's father had evidence of widespread corruption, and before he was murdered, he passed this evidence on to his son, and now the mobsters are threatening the boy's life, until Gloria steps in to try to get him to safety. This is a later film by Lumet, and definitely one of his lower-tiered ones. It doesn't deliver very well on either an emotional or an action thriller level, although Stone does have a few truly funny line deliveries that would be funnier in a different movie. It just all kind of plays out in an uninteresting way, and to be honest, it's hard even to scrounge up enough to say about it. It feels like a lazy effort that anyone could have directed, which is disappointing given how great Lumet can be. The January Man stars Kevin Kline as a renowned former detective who took the fall for his brother's fraud and is now, years later, controversially reinstated to help catch a serial killer. This script was written by John Patrick Shanley, who I frequently love, but this script definitely feels half-baked and can't quite land its tone. The best moments are the more playful ones, particularly the interactions between Kline and his artist neighbor, played by Alan Rickman, but both the mystery and romance portions of the story are woefully underdeveloped. The mystery is so laughable, I genuinely thought it was going to be a story of protagonist hubris whenever he was proven wrong, except he wasn't, and Kline's romance with two different women is abruptly dropped whenever it's convenient. I don't usually suggest movies should be longer. I enjoy a tight script, but this definitely felt like there were 15 minutes missing, which could help patch up some of these holes. A strange and uneven movie with a couple high points. The Medicine Man tells the story of a young woman who works for her overbearing, abusive father in his store, but then she falls in love with a swindler from a traveling circus played by Jack Benny. There's really very little going on in this movie. There is some light conflict where she worries that maybe her father won't let her leave, or will treat her younger brother badly if she does leave, but overall the stakes are pretty light, and it's mostly just people wandering around from the traveling circus. It was one of those movies where I could feel myself forgetting about it while I was in the middle of watching it. For some of the other movies in this project where I've been watching through 100 movies from 1930, I've been able to lean into an interesting film history component, even when I've been bored by the narrative. But as much as I tried to find one, there wasn't much to grasp onto for this. There's just nothing remarkable or worth caring about in this one, and I can't say much more about it because I've already forgotten most of it. Being the Ricardos tells the story of one particularly tense week in the life of Lucille Ball, when rumors were flying that she was a communist, which could have led to her being blacklisted from her TV show. On top of that, she's just learned she's pregnant and having doubts about her husband's faithfulness, so it's a high-stress week all around. Given the fact that I often really love Sorkin's writing, I found this very disappointing. The dialogue doesn't sparkle the way his best work does. It feels instead like a dull, by-the-book narrative that chose the least interesting pieces of the story to focus in on. The script is certainly the weakest part, though. Nicole Kidman does an impressively good job as Lucy, despite some distracting makeup effects, and Javier Bardem is pretty good as Desi, if never quite disappearing into the role. The cinematography works for me as well, jumping between the stylized fantasy of 1950s television and the way things actually were, in a way that highlights the contrast. There's enough good here to make it worth a watch if you're already interested in the story or someone involved in the project, but if not, you can probably skip it. Kimi is Steven Soderbergh's latest movie, a pandemic-era thriller about a girl responsible for cataloging errors for the newest Siri-style digital assistant. One day, she hears what sounds like a violent act, and as she digs deeper, she discovers both that it might be worse than she thought and that she doesn't know who to tell about it. This is a fantastic concept, and being set at a point in the pandemic where a lot of folks, including our protagonist, are still working from home gives it a vibe that reminds me of Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. That being said, the mystery isn't as tight as that one was. It unravels a bit in the final third, as the conspiracy gets slightly too big and involves too many pieces and makes our protagonist feel less relatable. But it's a minor quibble, as the rest of the movie is paced and shot beautifully, feeling claustrophobic even in the scenes when we're out in the world. Definitely worth a watch, even if it didn't land as smoothly as I hoped. Ladies of Leisure is the 1930 movie that made Barbara Stanwyck a star after a series of flops. She plays an escort who becomes a model for a painter, and the two fall in love despite her unsavory background. The film certainly paints its story in broad strokes, and doesn't ever quite sell the narrative that the two ever like each other until, bam, they're in love, and you don't know why. But there are some really interesting moments here, particularly in seeing an early Stanwyck performance where the persona she crafted so beautifully in her later films was not yet there.
She's flightier here than I've ever seen her, and while it's a little startling, it mostly works. And when she brings home the emotional stakes at the end as she has to decide whether or not to leave the man she loves, it definitely works. It's also interesting as an early Frank Capra film, as he uses some intriguing fade-ins and fade-outs that I'm not fully convinced make sense, but they are definitely an artistic editing choice, which has usually been less noticeable in other films of 1930, so it was fun to see that here.
The Doorway to Hell is a 1930 gangster movie about a man getting ready to give up a life of crime and settle down with his romantic partner. Little does he know, however, that she is cheating on him with one of the other men in his gang, and his plans to get away from that lifestyle may not work out, and may instead endanger himself, his new wife, and his younger brother. This is an early James Cagney movie. He plays the cheating friend involved with the lead's wife, and it's interesting to see him as a side character instead of a lead, especially since the lead himself isn't very interesting in this story. In preparation for writing up this review a few days after seeing the movie, I revisited the Wikipedia page to refresh myself on the plot details and realized, to my surprise, I remembered very little of it. It all kind of blurs together for me, along with other gangster pictures of the same era. It certainly is one of the earlier examples, and I'm sure aficionados of the genre would notice where later movies took their lead from films like this, but it wasn't particularly interesting for me. 8-Bit Christmas is a holiday movie where a man tells the story of one of his childhood Christmases, in particular one where he was desperately trying to get a Nintendo, whether by purchasing it, winning it, or begging his parents until they got it for him for Christmas. This is absolutely a Christmas story for kids who grew up in the 80s, with its episodic storytelling and hyperbolic flights of fantasy and adult voiceover wryly commenting on the action, and it definitely taps into a fresher version of that childhood nostalgia. It works for me about as well as that one did, which is to say that it's charming and it has some fun moments, but I don't find it moving or deeply relatable for my own experience, and it's definitely banking hard on that relatability. It's the kind of thing that does indeed only make sense to watch around the holidays, when my nostalgia levels are turned way up and I can be nostalgic for a childhood that wasn't even mine and still have a good time with it. The Tragedy of Macbeth is Joel Coen's take on Shakespeare's Scottish play, starring Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand as the scheming couple who murder a king to fulfill a mysterious prophecy and take his place, only to be slowly driven mad by it. Macbeth is one of my favorite Shakespeare tragedies, which made it all the more frustrating that this one feels so stilted. Washington in particular is a disappointment. He's a great actor, but here his extremely understated line deliveries make it nearly impossible to follow the poetry of what he's saying. On the plus side, though, the film does look truly stunning. I love how each location just seems to just blend into the next, as if we're all wandering through the fog and occasionally stumbling on an important place. And there are some really good performances in here, particularly Corey Hawkins as Macduff, who brings a level of sympathy to the role I've rarely seen, and Catherine Hunter as the Witches, who is utterly otherworldly. So it's a mixed bag when it comes to the big players, but there's a lot to like scattered throughout. Raffles tells the story of a charming man about town who happens to be at a dinner party on a night when the police suspect a home robbery will take place. We begin to learn that he might have criminal ties himself, putting at risk his relationship with another rich socialite. There's something about Raffles' roguishness that absolutely endears him to the audience, despite learning he is in fact a thief partway through the film. He seems to wish the people around him no ill will, and even see them with fondness, while also making plans to steal their valuables. The actual narrative arc is a little thin, and the cinematography is not especially noteworthy, but watching these characters interact is more enjoyable than I expected, and the final showdown scene is satisfying, if tied up a little too neatly. It's certainly not the best gentleman thief movie around, but it's an adequate one. Ron's Gone Wrong is an animated children's film about a near future in which every child has their own robot designed to help them make friends. Our main character, Barney, desperately wants one, but his family is too poor. His father finally manages to get his hands on a bootleg robot, only to find out it's extremely glitchy and can't do most of what Barney wants. This is basically just Big Hero 6 for younger kids with uglier animation. It's a cute concept, sure. Who doesn't love a slightly broken robot trying to understand humanity? But it's a little too on the nose with its intended metaphor about children and screens, and its big adventure ending requires way too much suspension of disbelief. And the redemption arc of the minor antagonists kind of comes out of nowhere, and I still don't trust them. Totally watchable, but I'd rather just rewatch Big Hero 6. Walk on the Wild Side tells the story of a man returning back home to reunite with his girlfriend after spending the last few years taking care of his dying father.
His girlfriend, however, moved on from him after he left and is now living and working in a brothel in New Orleans, and she is certain when he finds her that he won't want to be with her anymore. While the melodrama in this film is at extremely high levels, I found it kind of captivating, and when I dug down as to why, I realized it was because most of the key players in this were women. Yes, our central protagonist is a man, but the women around him are most fascinating, particularly characters played by Barbara Stanwyck and Jane Fonda, who are mesmerizing, and I could watch an entire movie about just the two of them. This adds a new slant to what feels like otherwise a very familiar story, and it kept me interested the whole way through. And while the story is tropey, it's not told badly by any means, it's just predictable. This is one I'd recommend, if only to see some great performances from some great actresses. 40 Guns is about a group of reformed gunslinger brothers who come to town to help restore order. Currently, the town is at the mercy of Jessica Drummond's gang of outlaws. Drummond is played by Barbara Stanwyck. By apparently complete coincidence, this is the second time she played a character with that name, and she is easily the best part of the movie. I've been watching a bunch of Stanwyck films over the last month, and I'm beginning to realize my favorite performances of her are her later ones. She just gives off a different level of subtle charisma at 50 than she did at 30, and I find it very compelling how she can do so much with so little. The rest of the story feels like every other Western about lawmakers trying to put a town back into shape, just from the occasional angle of, but what if the outlaw is a woman? Which leads to a predictable and somewhat disappointing ending. Definitely worth watching if you're a fan of Stanwyck's work or of Westerns in general, but it isn't a shining star outside of either of those two categories. Jeopardy tells the story of a family vacationing in rural Mexico when a freak accident leaves the husband trapped under a log by the beach as the tide is coming in. His wife must go off on her own to try to find someone to help them before he is fully submerged, but the only person she finds is going to be more danger to them than anything else. This is a really engaging little self-contained story. The tension of the rising tide and her husband's impending doom is easily felt, and frequently showing us how he's doing as she's off trying to find someone who speaks English enough to help her helps keep that tension high. The movie is short, at just over an hour, and turns out that's the perfect length for something with this simple a narrative through line, so there's definitely not enough time to get bored or feel like they're padding the length. I'd never heard of this before I watched it, but it's a pretty great little gem to have found. People on Sunday is a German film that famously cast non-actors to portray a day in the life of an average Berlin resident. It's also the earliest movie I've seen credited to Billy Wilder as a writer, several years before he went on to his well-known work in the United States. This film, like many in the 1930 Project, is more historically interesting than narratively interesting, at least for me. Realism wasn't super in vogue at this point in film history, so seeing it sought for in this film, even to the point of not wanting trained actors in the role, is an interesting change from many of the other films I've been seeing. The movie also does keep the stakes realistically low. Characters go on picnics, flirt with each other, and have small arguments, but not with anything resembling an overall arc. It's just a little slice of life film. While I don't have any interest in returning to it anytime soon, I'm glad I've seen it, and I know a little bit more about this movie now. The Blue Angel is about a strict professor and the nightclub singer his students have become enamored with. He goes down to meet her after scolding his students about the attention they pay to her, but he ends up falling in love himself. This is rather a fascinating little tragedy that doesn't take it all the path I expected it to. It's such an interesting twist to see the stern professor not only fall in love with the woman he's been warning his students about, but for that to be his downfall ultimately as well. And while it definitely paints the woman, played by Marlene Dietrich, as the primary cause of his demise, it does a surprisingly good job of humanizing her as well. She seldom seems malicious, just unhappy, and used to finding her own happiness wherever she can take it. I also really liked how the film used Dietrich's musical numbers to paint the story's emotional tone, from risque to sweet to ominous. Overall, definitely a good watch from director Joseph von Sternberg. Tiny Furniture is a film written by, directed by, and starring Lena Dunham as a recent college graduate who has moved back in with her mother and sister, unsure what she wants to do with her life moving forward. I haven't seen a lot of Dunham's work, so I can't compare this with much, but it certainly has a distinct vibe to it, a sort of mishmash between mumblecore and overly erudite dialogue you might find in something by Aaron Sorkin. Our central character is hard to care about, as she just casually manipulates everyone around her to no apparent end. Not that there can't be great movies made about selfish people, but there has to be something to hook us into the core of the story, and this doesn't have that. Because of that and the lack of overall character development, I remember some individual scenes from this movie, but no narrative arc. I can't even remember in which order scenes happen because they have so little impact on each other. I don't know that this movie is bad per se, but it's definitely made with a specific style in mind, and that style isn't for me. Tell It to the Bees is set in 1950s Scotland, told through the eyes of a young boy whose father has run off. He befriends the new female doctor in town, as does his mother, and soon there are rumors flying that the relationship between the mother and the doctor is something beyond friendship. While this kind of forbidden love story is sometimes told in an almost lurid fashion, I liked how here it is centered initially on their friendship and companionship, only later blossoming into something more. There's a sweetness to the movie, which is very charming, and when things get particularly difficult for this little family, it feels just sadly off. Like, these people shouldn't have to have such a tough go of it. The sweetness grounds it, rather than making it cheesy or sentimental, and it keeps it from feeling overly melodramatic or exploitative of these characters' misery. It's not a spectacular film, but it is one that I really enjoyed. Last Night in Soho stars Thomasin Mackenzie as a young fashion student with a gift for the supernatural. She becomes fascinated with a ghost, a young woman from the 1960s who seems to have it all, until the darker parts of her past are revealed and leave Mackenzie deeply troubled. This was nothing like I expected it to be as an Edgar Wright film, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, just a different one. It's not a comedy, for one, but a strange, surreal horror mystery that I found thoroughly compelling once I stopped expecting witty one-liners and meta-commentary, though Wright's familiar gift for finding the perfect soundtrack is definitely on display here. The story comes to a rather melodramatic climax, but it all works for me. It goes on a ride from coming-of-age story to nightmarish horror to gothic melodrama, and maybe not having any idea what the film was beforehand made that an easier transition, as I wasn't expecting it to settle into one of those genres. It's absolutely nothing like Wright's made before, but it's a fascinating step in a new direction for him, and I wouldn't be sorry to see more of it. Paramount on Parade is a 1930 review of stars involved in Paramount Pictures, including names I recognize now like Jean Arthur, Maurice Chevalier, and William Powell, as well as many, many stars I don't know at all. I assumed going in that this would be primarily musical numbers, but it's pretty evenly split between musical numbers and silly sketches. My favorite of the latter is a mystery parody called Murder Will Out that features 4 actors portraying characters they were well known for playing on screen in mysteries, and it is spectacularly silly. Quite a few of these pieces, however, feel like they go right over my head, partly because the pop culture references are almost unrecognizably dated, even for someone relatively well-versed in classic cinema, and partly because the version I saw has definitely deteriorated enough that the sound quality was difficult to parse at times. While I did find moments I enjoyed, and I really enjoyed them, there was a lot of waiting around until one piece was over in the hopes that I'd like the next one better. An interesting little time capsule, but not necessarily one I'd rewatch. Flea is a Danish animated docudrama about Amin, a man who fled Afghanistan as a child refugee. The film features primarily voiceover of adult Amin over animation of him as a young man making his journey to a safer country. The use of animation is striking here. As Amin shares his past, including the family he was told to never admit was still alive, it feels like the film is preserving some sense of his privacy by showing only an animated facsimile of his face. Older or more difficult memories are drawn as rough sketches, again almost giving the illusion of politely looking away to make it more comfortable for someone to bare their soul to us. It carves out an easy path for empathy, but never feels like it's exploiting someone's tragedy. The very occasional use of live footage to show referenced locations is jarring, but all we need to remind us that yes, this is still a real person sharing their story with us. I haven't seen many movies like this, but I was fascinated, and I'm glad to have seen it. Something the Lord Made is a TV biopic about the first cardiac surgery ever performed. Alan Rickman plays scientist Alfred Blaylock, who heads up the research, and Mos Def plays his assistant Vivian Thomas, who turns out to be just as talented, if not more than Blaylock, but is consistently overlooked because he is African American. Cardiac surgery is one of those things that obviously I knew in my head had to have been innovated at some point in the recent past, but I didn't really know anything about how it went down, so it was interesting to see the obstacles in the way of making it happen, and how it really was presumed to just be eternally beyond the bounds of medicine. I did find it extremely distracting, although yes, historically accurate, how heavy the focus was on animal experimentation. It was pretty upsetting to watch them deliberately diminishing a dog's oxygen supply so they could then figure out how to fix it. And while that was absolutely part of the history, it definitely undercuts the film's attempted hooray for science attitude throughout, and it makes it tough to recommend. Although the story itself is an interesting one, told in decent biopic format with some good performances. Weekend is a Jean-Luc Godard film about a couple who goes on a weekend vacation that gets violent and surreal and French New Wave. I should probably put in this preface that Godard is one of those filmmakers that I find actively irritating, so I did not have high hopes for this. I've had long conversations about him with friends who adore his work, and I just never come any closer to liking it. This mostly stays in that vein. These long, sprawling shots that seem to be doing nothing, rambling philosophical conversations that seem to not be involved with the plot at all, camera work that feels so pretentious in a way I find myself constantly resisting. There is, however, one sequence that I found remarkably effective. There is almost an 8-minute scene that is one long tracking shot following a traffic jam over probably 3/4 of a mile. And as we follow one car trying to get past the blockage and see the reactions of all the other drivers stuck in place, it remains surprisingly compelling throughout. I thought that was really fascinating. And I thought to myself, maybe this will be the Godard film that changes my mind. But sadly, though, that was the only piece of the film that I liked. The Lost Daughter stars Olivia Colman as a woman on vacation in Greece, where she forms a strange bond with a family vacationing in the same area. Her time there is intercut with flashbacks of her young adulthood with her 2 daughters. This is one of the slowest burns I've seen in a long time. At one point I said to my husband, it's been 30 minutes, and so far it's just people being on the beach near other people. It does build to a payoff, but it really leans into the slow unraveling of the facts. Coleman is incredibly restrained and subtle for the majority of this, and that makes her character extremely enigmatic. This is Maggie Gyllenhaal's directorial debut, and while I can see where she was going with it, it mostly didn't work for me. Not just because it's too slow, but because that enigmatic restraint feels too often like it's going nowhere, and I'm not convinced that the ending ties it together in a coherent way, although it is mildly interesting. I like the attention Gyllenhaal pays to her central character. I just wish I was more drawn in by her story. King Richard is a biopic about Richard Williams, the very involved father of tennis sensations Venus and Serena Williams. Will Smith plays him in this film, and we see him coordinating opportunities for his daughters, setting the parameters of their training, and occasionally making controversial decisions to bring them to stardom through unconventional means. Smith is pretty great in this role. He did a lot of research and spent a fair amount of time with the actual Richard Williams, and it pays off in the way his character feels more fleshed out than a lot of biopic leads. There are a few narrative surprises here if you know the Williams sisters' story already, but it does a lovely job of bringing it to life. The young actresses playing Venus and Serena just radiate confidence and positivity, which is charming, even if it sometimes reaches the point where they don't entirely feel like real teenagers so much as symbols of success for Richard to guide. I would have liked to see a little bit more focus on the girls and their relationship with tennis and each other and their father. The few moments we do see of that are by far the most compelling. Overall, though, a very watchable movie. The Devil's Holiday reminded me very much of another movie from 1930, F.W. Murnau's City Girl. Both feature a naive young farmer who comes to the big city for business and returns home with a wife his family is skeptical of. Only in this case, the family is right to be skeptical since she is only there for his money. There's a simplicity to this movie that is very appealing, and our young female lead is pretty good, especially in the sequence where she's starting to have a change of heart. She's snippy and irritable, and while at first it seems like it's because she's an unpleasant person, it starts to become clear that she's not really happy with herself for the decisions she's made, and it comes out as anger. It never quite reaches the heights of City Girl when it comes to charm, but it's a quiet, sweet little movie that was just fine to watch. Nobel Son is a way too complicated thriller about an insufferable Nobel Prize winner, his wife, and his son, who is kidnapped while he's away accepting the prize. I guess I won't spoil this by going any further into detail, but there are about 10 different twists going on here, and none of them make sense. I think there was an attempt to make this partly a dark comedy. Some of the big dramatic moments are so silly, they feel like they must have been somewhat self-aware and meant as jokes, but I think a startlingly large number of them were just intended to be cool, mind-bending reveals. None of them are, especially as they render earlier scenes just absolutely baffling and obscure character motivations so many times that it's impossible to know or care who is on whose side by the end. There is some enjoyment to be gotten out of the over-the-top performances of Alan Rickman as the Nobel Prize winner, who was level 10 obnoxious for no reason, and Eliza Dushku, the son's love interest. But overall, it's just too convoluted and too convinced it's clever.